Hello, campaigners. John Bose here, one of the co-hosts of the Campaign Rundown podcast. That podcast is about all things election campaigns. I'm coming at you with a campaign theory tip that is about the narrative that all campaigns must include with their organizing meetings and conversations they have about supporters, specifically explaining to supporters how they can best help the election campaign. This tip looks at GEOTV coding, how to use personal networks to identify voters, and getting the information back to the campaign in a timely manner. So let's jump right into the tip. This narrative needs to be memorized by everyone on the campaign field staff, so it can be used as part of the organizing meeting and in any conversations that the staff have with new supporters. The campaign will want to customize the narrative to meet the specific election needs and develop campaign material that supporters can take home so they can do stuff on their own. Let's start with the narrative. If you want to win elections, you don't win elections by trying to convince people who don't agree with you that you're right. You win elections by finding people that do agree with you and making sure they vote on election day. Okay, so let's start by talking about something called GEOTV. GEOTV is a part of the election process that you basically identify your voters who support you and make sure on election day they show up to the polls to vote for you. And just so everyone understands what I'm talking about, I want to spell out GEOTV and what it means. So GEOTV means get out the vote. And it's a process that's used in the last part of the election that you go and drive every single person that's been identified that supports your candidate to the polls. Make sure they vote. Now, that process is 100% dependent on what happened earlier in the election campaign, which is the identifying of voters. And that is based off of what's called the GEOTV scale. And let me talk to you about that real quick. So, when you are identifying voters, everyone uses the same universal scale. And been rated in a 1 through 5. And I'm talking about the 2016 election cycle. So if you had come out to vote and you were a huge Hillary supporter, you would have been labeled a 1. Now, if you had come out to vote, but you weren't a huge Hillary supporter and definitely hated Trump, so you were voting for Hillary, you would be labeled a leaning towards, which is a 2. Now, the general population has no idea what's going on in elections. So anyone who is completely undecided is labeled a 3. Now, the rest of the planet, normal people, have lives, so they don't pay attention to politics until we get to the final weeks. Most of the population will be labeled a 3 until we get to the final push. So, then we have the people that are 4s and 5s. Anyone who, let's say, is a Republican and hates Trump and would rather not have him on the ballot, but still voted for him because he's a Republican, is labeled a 4, which is a leaning away. Now, they may not have voted, they may have actually blanked the ballot, but regardless, they didn't vote for the Democrats, so that's a 4. And anyone that wears the hats, owns the signs, put up the flag, and puts the t-shirt on, that's labeled a 5. We have supporting, which are the people that are labeled 1s in the database. These are supporters of your candidate. Then we have the people who lean towards your candidate. We have the general population, which are the people who are undecided. And then we have the people that are leaning away, the 4s. And then, of course, we have the people that are opposed to your candidate. So everyone who is registered to vote is rated from 1 to 5 on a GEOTV scale. And this information is fed into a database, which I'll talk about next. Okay, so you understand what the GEOTV code is. Now let me show you how it's actually implemented in elections. So a campaign will have what's called a voter database. And this database is a list of everyone that is registered to vote in a district. The database also includes a complete voting history for each voter. So campaigns can use it to predetermine who is likely to support them. Now, what the campaign does is they go out and they talk to as many voters as possible. I'm going to use red for 5 and blue for ones. So they go out and they start identifying votes. And as they go through identifying votes, they're recording this information in the actual database. So that as a voter is contacted, that information is then put into the database as either a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And what happens is when we get towards the end of the campaign, last month, let's say October 1st, the campaign does a calculation. It takes a look at the actual database and it figures out how many 5s they have and how many 1s they have. Now, if they have more 1s than 5s on October 1st, well, the election is pretty much over. And they switch from doing voter contacting to basically their GEOTV strategy, which is they start only talking to the people that are identified as 1s and 2s until Election Day. And that's important to understand because if one of these voters completely forgets to vote, that can cost them an election. And we've seen in the last couple of weeks, months actually, that a lot of these elections are very close. So from October 1st to Election Day, their one and only goal is to reach out to every single one of the people that is a supporter and make sure they have a plan for voting, they know where they're voting, and they have a method to get there. So that's all that matters because on October 1st, they have more 1s than 5s. But what if they're not lucky? What if they're in the other direction where they have more 5s than 1s? Well, then between October 1st and 2 weeks before the election, this campaign, which has more 5s than 1s, is going to spend all their time contacting all these undecided voters, the 3s, and convincing them to support their candidate. And 2 weeks out, regardless of if they've made their goal, they're going to go dark just like somebody who had met their goal on October 1st. And in the last 2 weeks, they're going to focus only on the people that support them. So the 5 through 1 scale is used to identify voters. And the goal is to identify as many voters as possible, get them into your database, and then the last month, once you've got your IDs in, concentrate on only talking to your supporters. If, on the other hand, you have more 5s than 1s in your database, you're going to go back and do what's called persuasion calls and persuasion contact, where you talk to people who are undecided or 2s and make sure they're on your side. So 2s and 3s get contacted. Last 2 weeks, you regardless go over to GEOTV and you only talk to the people that like you. Okay, so we've talked about the GEOTV code and have explained how that's used by campaigns to win elections. Now, what are we going to do to implement this so we have a solid grassroots effort? Well, I'm going to explain it to you and I'm going to use emojis because why not? So you're the happy face emoji in the middle. And as you know, you have relationships with people out in the world in a face-to-face situation. But you also have relationships with people on the web via email, via Twitter, maybe Facebook. Most people have Facebook. People in face-to-face situations. And you interact with them via these social media tools and online tools and make contact with additional people through them. Now, what we're going to ask you to do is use your personal relationship with these people to help identify where they stand. So when you're interacting with people in face-to-face situations, we want you to ask, are you supporting the Democrat in the upcoming election? And you're interacting with people on Facebook and Twitter. Now, I want to be clear on this. If somebody interacts with you and they've got an angry Trump pro post, you're going to just mark them as a 5 in the database and move on. Do not argue with them. Whereas if somebody likes one of your posts that you put out there that's maybe healthcare or clean environment, livable wage, you're going to mark them as a 1 and ask them if they'll support the Democrat in the upcoming election. And what we want you to do is go through and actually talk to people, marking the ones that are pro and marking the ones that are anti as 1s and 5s. And of course you have everyone that falls in between. You've got 4s, you do have your 5s, and basically using your network to identify people. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this information and put it into our database. So you go through, you build out the actual list, and then we're going to create this database that records that information. Now, when you identify them, you're basically going to ask for the person's name, their town, and either a phone number or an email. And they'll go into our database. Once in our database, they'll receive one phone call or email to confirm that they are supporting the Democrat in the upcoming election and asked if they'd like to volunteer. If they'd like to volunteer, they'll get more emails. If not, they are going to be on our list until election day. The 2 weeks before, we'll remind them to vote. Now, in order to do this, we put together some tools that I'm going to share with you. The first one is the pledge card. So it is an index card with a basic form that asks the person's name, email, phone number, and city, and then they sign it to say that they pledge support for the Democrats. On the back, it has our P.O. box, and you can mail that in. Now, that's for anyone that you identify as a 1 or a 2. On the other hand, if you have people that are not supporting us, we want to know about that too. That's why we've got the Got 10 form. And this form is basically the same thing. It has all the information about how to identify supporters. And on the right-hand side, it has the scale from 1 to 5. And on the left-hand side, it has a place for you to put information on the actual individual. Same thing, you basically take this and it has our address on the back. You can mail it to us or you can drop it off. In addition to this, we have online tools that allow you to use identification. So you can see the web address right down here. So what we're asking you to do is use your personal network to talk to people to find out if they're with us, 1s and 2s, or against us, 4s and 5s. And of course, there's a whole bunch of 3s and we need to know about them as well. Once you've collected the information, that information you will send to us and it goes into our voter database. They'll receive one email from us asking them to confirm that they are supporting the Democrat in the upcoming election. At that time, they can choose to volunteer and get involved with the effort. But if they choose not to, that is the only phone call they will get from us, and then they will be off the list until election week, and we will call them and remind them to vote. So this is our grassroots effort. It's incredibly important that you use your personal relationship with people to reach out to them and identify whether they're supporting us or not. Now that we've had a chance to review the narrative, before you start customizing it, I want to go over the 3 key points. First is the narrative needs to explain how the GEOTV coding system works. Second, make sure you explain how individual supporters can use their personal network to identify who is supporting the campaign and who is detracting from the campaign. Third, and most important, stress the fact that anyone who is identified by a supporter, that information needs to get back to the campaign. Before using this narrative, the campaign will have to build out key elements such as data collection tools and an organized database that can hold the information on voters. Also, you will want to build out customized material so that it is easy for an individual supporter to do things on their own, independent of staff. Please make sure you check out all the tip related to this specific narrative in the related tips section.